Hello and welcome. My name is Father William Maestri, and this is Overfed and Undernourished. This is the second of a 10-part series dealing with the issue of religious freedom. In our first program, we went through the various meanings of religious and freedom. And we looked at the meaning of those words and how, frankly, they have changed and evolved over time, historically and culturally, from the classical period down to our own time today. In the second installment on the topic of religious freedom, we turn our attention to natural rights. What are natural rights? Natural rights are those rights that an individual, a person, a human being, is born with. It's not something given to the individual by government. It's not something that democracy bestows. It's not a political endowment. It comes in the very nature of the person himself or herself. That is, natural rights are species specific. Homo sapiens have natural rights by the mere fact, which is a big fact, that they are human. And these rights, as Thomas Jefferson indicated, some of them in the Declaration of Independence, are life, liberty, property, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, Jefferson did not say property, although everyone took for granted that property was a natural right. And it was so well accepted that Jefferson probably felt it wasn't necessary to say it. But it's life, liberty, property, and the pursuit of happiness. The order of those natural rights, which belong to each and every human being by the fact that that person is human, those rights, those natural rights, delineated by Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence, the order is important. The first of the natural rights is the right to life, because the first law, the first natural law of human nature and of the natural law is self-preservation. There is no possible enjoyment of any right, statutory or civil, if in fact you happen to be dead at the moment. That's a rather difficult thing to achieve, because once you're dead, goodbye to your rights. So rights is primary and fundamental for the enjoyment and experiencing in daily life of any other right. Life has to be protected, and it was understood protected from the moment of conception to the point of natural death, and all points in between. That reverence was given to life. And life then proceeds into liberty. One has to be free. One has to be able to navigate through the things of life. One has to be free in terms of speech and thought, work, the development of skills, etc., in order to sustain and perhaps develop life. And the pursuit of happiness. The pursuit of happiness is not the guarantee of happiness. I cannot guarantee you happiness. And contrary to what some in government think, they cannot guarantee you happiness. Government cannot guarantee you happiness. What we hope for is that there is the removal of those injustices and barriers, social and political, systemic and otherwise, within a society that prevents individuals from achieving that happiness. Happiness being living a well-ordered, fulfilled human life, not an extravagant life, but a life lived well. That is, developing one's talents and gifts. These are natural rights. These are rights, again, and it's important to say them. In today's vocabulary, we often talk about natural rights, and today we talk about them as human rights. The Declaration of Human Rights by the United Nations and various other bodies that have this Declaration of Human Rights or natural rights. Where do natural rights come from? If we don't make them, if government doesn't give them, where do they come from? Well, the two answers that have come down through the ages is they come from God or they come from nature. Now, Thomas Jefferson was crafty. He blended both of those together. These natural rights, these human rights, they proceed from nature or nature's God. In other words, they are inalienable rights. They are rights that we discover, not rights that we make. Well, how do we discover these rights? What book do we go to? Well, a good place to start would be history, but the real laboratory for the discovery and the evolving of the understanding of human rights is sustained generational historical reflection on human nature and human experience. Because the human being has a certain structure, a certain amount of givens and predictability, that person operates because of the gift of reason, the intellect, and free will, along with having to contend with the passions, the emotions, which influence both freedom of choice and our ability to think. We collect that kind of ongoing wisdom and experience, and we place it within the depository of wisdom about human nature and how that human nature can flourish and develop. But it doesn't stay inside of human nature. It doesn't stay inside of human nature because the human being, in addition to being rational, having an intellect, in addition to being free, having a free will, the individual is also social. By nature, the human being is a social being. That is, life is lived with others and hopefully for others. Therefore, the question of society arises. And the importance of society is the reflection on how do we live together as people? How do we live together as individuals so that we become a community, a people, based hopefully on justice and freedom and peace, respect for life, and all of the other natural rights that societies try to foster and develop so that we can live peacefully and justly with one another. So natural human rights metastasize. They spread out to forming communities and societies and nations by laws and other instruments in order to help us to live peaceably with one another. So natural rights belong specifically to human beings. They are God-given, or if you're of the persuasion that they come purely from nature or nature's God. They are not things that we make, but they are things that we discover through long millennia and centuries of empirical verification and observation of how human beings behave and what factors are at work. And history teaches a great deal about this, how human beings act and react. And we're also social beings. How to form societies, because not every society that is formed forms in a way that enhances human life. That requires an evolution as well. And one final distinction that I would like to make before we move on to the two other areas of rights, namely legal rights and civil rights, is we make a distinction between society and the state. Society is a natural development of the person as a social being. In other words, it is a natural entity. It flows out of our nature. The state is an artificial development. It is made by the intellect and the will and various external forces. There are good states and there are bad states. There are states that respect human rights, promote human rights, and there are regimes which are oppressive. They are imperialistic. They engage in torture. They repress religious liberty as well as freedom of thought, freedom to assembly, and all of the other freedoms that we take for granted too often. So we have to make those distinctions, that the state is an artificial creation. We constantly are making and remaking the state. Every time we pass laws, every time Congress meets, every time a new regime comes into power, it's remade. What we cannot remake over and over again, we cannot remake human nature. It is not within our powers to do that. We don't have that particular ability. Now, are human rights the only kind of rights that we have? No, not at all. The other two categories that we talk about, although we may not even use the name or think about them, are legal rights and civil rights. Legal rights are those rights that an individual has based upon the legitimate lawmaking body, the legislature, enacting laws, rules, and regulations for the good of society. Therefore, those rights are legal rights. They accrue to the person on the basis of a legislative act enforced by the executive and ruled to be constitutional or to have authority by, say, the judicial branch, to use the United States model or the American model. The second are civil rights. Civil rights are rights that are extended to citizens who belong to a given political and social community. And these vary from place to place, requirement to requirement. Not all civil societies, not all civil communities, not all civil groups have the same rules and regulations for belonging, for getting the privileges. But with the privileges, also the responsibilities and the obligations to work for the common good, to work for the common good. It's important to understand that we can have laws that are enacted by a duly elected legislature. We can have civil rights that are extended to citizens, etc. But they are not legitimate laws because they may very well violate the natural law. That is, the law of natural rights. For example, we can legitimately all go vote, and we vote to deny voting rights and various other kinds of legal rights to all people who have blonde hair. Well, of course it's silly, but the silliness drives the point. We make that law. Now people vote for that, and they enact that law. Or we don't allow people to vote on the basis of their skin color, their religion, their national origin. We don't allow them to vote on the basis of their religion. We don't allow them to participate in the life of the civil society, and the law backs that up, on the basis of sexual orientation. Just because a person happens to be a homosexual does not mean that they cease to be a human being, that they cease to not have human rights. We need to be clear about that. That orientation does not determine the humanity of a person. That is still a human being. And therefore, there are laws which call for us to question them in light of the natural law, in light of natural rights. Therefore, legitimate laws that are legal and laws that extend civil rights must be in conformity with the natural moral law. They must be in conformity, support, protect, and defend the natural rights that all human beings have by the fact that they are human. And I think that these distinctions are important, but it's important to see that of the centrality of the dignity of the human person, and the primary right is that right to life. That is first, because all other rights, again, flow from them. Natural rights, legal rights, and civil rights. That is the grounding principle, is the principle of natural rights. That's why when you go back and you read the documents of the Founding Fathers, their letters, You read the debates. You talk about the Federalist Papers. You look at the record kept by Madison. Some of the most meticulous records kept by James Madison of the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. Meticulous, has almost like a recording. He was so wanting to preserve the debate, the ideas, and the issues that were flowing. And time again, it turned back to and centered on the natural rights of the human being in their reason and in their freedom, and the importance and centrality of religious freedom. Madison was one of the great writers on religious freedom. His work in the Virginia Declaration on Religious Freedom is one of the great documents in the history, not only of America, but of thought about the role of religious freedom for the individual and for public life. The contribution of religious freedom for public life. And therefore, now we've talked about natural rights, we've talked about legal rights, we've talked about the importance of civil rights and the importance of these inalienable, objective, inherent, universal, natural rights that apply to all human beings everywhere, at all times, in all places. The question that we now want to consider, and tying this together, hopefully, is what is the connection between natural rights and religious liberty, or religious freedom? Well, it is fundamental. It is fundamental. Why? Because every human being, by nature, seeks and has a fundamental right to pursue the truth. We are made for truth because we want that kind of knowledge of the truth in order to, not only for ourselves, but to be in the truth, because it is that which makes us and develops us as human beings. People who seek religious truth, people who seek a truth above the conventional wisdom or the everyday occurrences of life, they look to what we might call a sacred or transcendent truth. Whether it be in sacred scriptures, whether it be in the teachings of their church, whether it be in the teaching of their minister, their rabbi, their religious leader, what have you. We look for that truth. We hunger and thirst for that truth. Now, that truth that we are seeking is not something we invent. It's something we hunger and thirst for because we're looking for it, which ultimately leads one to say, what we are looking for is God. Why? Because God is truth. God, all truth resides in God. There is no truth, at least as faith and reason works together, there is no truth that will lead us away from God if we are open and if we look deeply into the mysteries of whatever truth it is. The more and more one discovers in science, for example. We often today, we're bombarded with the idea that if you're a religious believer, you're anti-science. Nothing could be further from the truth. In fact, modern science got its origins in the church, its origins in the Bible, because nature is orderly, predictable, and it can be known. That's in Scripture. And some of the greatest earliest discoverers and thinkers about science, they were steeped in the Christian and the Judeo-Christian tradition and in biblical beliefs. So this separation between science and religion, faith and reason, I would suggest a reading to you. Read St. Pope John Paul II's magnificent encyclical. It's a tour de force. in answer to this question. Fides et ratio, translation, faith and reason. Not faith by itself, that often flies off into fanaticism. Not reason by itself, it leaves us with a kind of dry science or naturalism. It's faith and reason together that bring us into wisdom. And that first liberty, that natural right, that statutory right, that legal right, is the protection and defending of the right for the individual to seek the truth and to seek an ultimate truth, a truth which transcends human knowledge in this world. And there are societies, there are regimes, there are political arrangements, right this very moment, here in the 21st century, which are repressive, they persecute, they limit, deny, restrict the right of religious worship, of religious inquiry, of religious assembly, of religious speaking. Those regimes deny the fundamental basic right of the individual to seek the truth. Now, if the natural right of a person is social, because we are social beings, religious freedom is also social and contributes to the well-being of society. The idea that religion, and I'm going to speak in terms of Christianity, because I'm a Christian, I'm a Catholic. I'm going to speak out of that faith tradition. There is nothing in Catholicism, that advocates degradation of human beings, disrespect for human life, for persons, advocates violence, destruction, unjust discriminations, and a whole host of things. The religion of Christianity, revealed in scriptures and certainly in the person of Jesus Christ, just the opposite. Take time to read the Sermon on the Mount, St. Matthew, chapters 5 through 7. What do you have? You don't have an ethic of division, of resentment, of strife, and of conflict. Love your enemies. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who abuse you. If you're struck on the right cheek, offer your left as well. Love your neighbor as yourself. The ethic of compassion, of forgiveness, of mercy, of laying down one's life for one's friends, the sacrifice of the cross, and that hope of resurrection. But also that realization that if we truly live in imitation of Christ, we also build a better world. We live better as human beings. The Russian writer and philosopher Dostoevsky said, if there is no God, all things are permitted. Think about that for a moment. If we live as if there is no God, there is no transcendent morality, there is no objective right and wrong, good and evil, all things are permitted. Why is that? Because all things are permitted by my will, my individual will, in which the strong conquer the weak, the rich abuse the poor, and those with influence take advantage of those who are considered non-essential. Is that really the world we want to live in? That's an anti-gospel. It's an anti-Christian ethic. So the contribution of Christianity and a right understanding of the world's great religions. Granted, they're abused. Christianity has been abused. Islam has been abused. various forms of Christianity. Terrible things have been done in the name of Jesus, in the name of Christianity. But the abuse is no argument against its proper use. And too often that's what we do today. We judge something by its failure and we say, you see, it doesn't work. Whereas the vast majority of the goodness and the fruits that result, they're simply dismissed or overlooked because we are so focused on what didn't work, what failed, what didn't materialize. And that's why the first of the rights, the first liberty, as it was called, in the Bill of Rights, which is going to be our next episode, so this leads us into the next episode, is that of religious liberty. And we need to ask the question, and we're going to ask it again in part 3, this is part 2, is why is religious liberty the first of the liberties mentioned in the Bill of Rights? Why did the founders and those who put that magnificent Constitution, which has survived for over 200 years and serves as a model for constitutions throughout the world, even those who don't believe it or enact them, it's the model. Why, when it came time for a Bill of Rights, the first of the rights was the right of religious liberty? It's an important question, and hopefully we'll give you a good answer when we get together for part 3 on religious liberty.